You see photos of mostly children that are helpless, that are dirty, that have not been washed, that have puffy hair, that are barefoot with torn clothing. So just children, mostly the most vulnerable category, or women. And they are always at their weakest. They're always at their lowest. And that always ends up, the photo, that always ends up in the front page or ends up on the front of a leaflet that is being distributed, or ends up a blog post's photo that you find online. And that becomes the only way that you understand who is a refugee. So automatically, a refugee, for any Western who is engaging with the refugee crisis, looks exactly like that. So when they encounter any refugee, they automatically have these assumptions that a refugee is a person who is not clean, a refugee who is a person who has not known hygiene, who's not civilized, have never read a book, who cannot speak languages, who's unable to learn, who have no agency, because that is visually what we created for them.
Welcome to Near East, the podcast that tries to make a sense of what's happening in the Middle East or Southwest Asia. Today I'm joined by Yafa El Masri, a human geographer and a lecturer at the University of East Anglia. She calls herself a born refugee and a researcher, with a focus on community-based research on forced displacement, specifically among Palestinian communities. Her more recent work focuses on refugee agency knowledge production, specifically in academia and policy frameworks. Hi, Yafa. How are you?
Hi, Francesca. Thank you for having me. I'm doing as well as I can be in these kinds of circumstances.
I'm really happy that you accepted to join this podcast. Since I started it, I always wanted to have you as a guest. Actually, since I met you last year at the Perugia Journalism Festival, I felt like I wanted to do something with you professionally. So I'm happy that this podcast is the right occasion.
No, I'm really happy you invited me. It was a really nice opportunity to connect with journalists like you that are really interested in changing the practice and working with refugees in more ethical ways.
I would like to start from your upbringing. You grew up in a small Palestinian refugee camp in Lebanon, and then you won a bunch of scholarships. And thanks to those, you could pursue higher education in Lebanon first, then in Italy, and now you're based in the UK. I would like to know, how has your identity shaped your way of doing research? Because you were born as a refugee, and you do research about refugees, which is not something really common as far as I know.
Yeah, it has been an interesting journey, to say the least. As you said, I was born a refugee, and to be also accurate and technical, I am still a refugee. The only difference is that I was born and raised in a small refugee camp in Beirut, the Lebanese capital, called Burj al-Barajne. And growing up, as any other refugee in the world, probably, there's always this strange power dynamic that you have with the rest of the world, but more specifically with anyone who's practicing a form of knowledge extraction. So the camp and any refugee community is almost always being studied by a journalist, by a researcher, by a humanitarian aid worker, by a policymaker. And so you become kind of that subject of knowledge rather than being an equal human. So I really wanted to change that dynamic. I really wanted to challenge it. I really wanted to change that image of the refugee that is imposed on us. So I grew up feeling like I cannot be myself. I have to be that image that they produce about me in the media of the refugee, I don't know, either being a victim or a terrorist, being violent or undercivilized, and all these images. And then you're not allowed to be who you are as a community or as a person. You can only be what that image that they produce of you. And that has a lot of power over you. And I really wanted to kind of challenge that. I wanted to produce something that is more from within the camp, and is really just passionate about making refugees advocate for themselves and produce a more accurate image and produce more accurate engagements with refugee lives. So I, as you said, applied for scholarships, which enabled me to get my undergrad in Beirut. And then I got my master's and PhD from the University of Padova in Italy. And throughout that entire journey, I was always focusing on this idea that we need to understand displacement in general differently. We need to understand refugees and refugee lives differently, and we need to engage with them differently as equal partners, as storytellers that we can learn from, rather than subjects that we are studying. So yeah, that has been my journey, and that has been why I ended up today as a lecturer who teaches on displacement and refugee studies, and also working with media and journalists and anyone who's interested in understanding how they can change the way that they work with refugees in more ethical ways, in more equitable ways, maybe.
During your panel at the Perugia Journalism Festival last year, I remember that you talked about your experience as a refugee and seeing researchers, journalists, even humanitarian workers coming into this camp, doing interviews, taking pictures. And I remember that you told the audience that in the camp, these kind of pictures that were taken were called UNICEF pictures. Can you tell me more about it?
Yeah, this is, I think, such a powerful story that I always like to repeat to people, because we are in such visual times, right? We're at times of Instagram and TikTok, and everybody wants to film everything. And I think that back then I didn't imagine that I will need to tell the world that you need to be very careful about what kind of visual production or what kind of visual representation are you having when engaging with refugee communities. And the story starts in growing up, and in any refugee community, including mine, we would always have people arriving with cameras, including humanitarian aid workers, but also journalists, researchers, and they would always want to document their visits. They want to show proof of the work that they've done. They want to collect data. They want to collect also material that they want to use for fundraising or for collection of support. And these photos were always consistent in how they represent refugees. So you always see mostly children. At that time, consent also meant something very different. So consent was not emphasized enough. But even in today's world where consent is emphasized, I still see the same dynamic, which is that you see photos of mostly children that are helpless, that are dirty, that have not been washed, that have puffy hair, that are barefoot with torn clothing. So just children, mostly the most vulnerable category, or women. And they are always at their weakest. They're always at their lowest. And that always ends up, the photo, that always ends up in the front page or ends up on the front of a leaflet that is being distributed, or ends up a blog post's photo that you find online. And that becomes the only way that you understand who is a refugee. So automatically, a refugee, for any Western who is engaging with the refugee crisis, looks exactly like that. So when they encounter any refugee, they automatically have these assumptions that a refugee is a person who is not clean, a refugee who is a person who has not known hygiene, who's not civilized, have never read a book, who cannot speak languages, who's unable to learn, who have no agency, because that is visually what we created for them. And because we've encountered that for so long, we've kind of grown as a refugee to already have a theory on that. And we've already now, when we see any journalist or we see any humanitarian aid worker with a camera, we have given it a name, and we, tell each other, oh, are they here for taking another UNICEF photo? And it wasn't because this was something exclusive to UNICEF per se, but perhaps it was because of the focus on children, and UNICEF works with children. But everybody was filming children, and everybody was filming children in very vulnerable conditions. And because of that focus on the refugee and reducing them to that childlike, vulnerable state, and having that image to summarize what a refugee means, that we've given it the name as the UNICEF photo, to mean that, this is the journalistic practice or the data collection practice of reducing the refugee to a helpless child. And this is obviously quite dangerous for a large number of reasons. I understand that refugee humanitarian agencies have been using that to raise funds, but also raise awareness about refugee crisis. But we also have to think, what is the cost? What is at what cost? What are the implications for that? And how does that also reflect on how we view refugees, how we treat them, how we engage with them, what kind of control policies are being born out of that, but also just in simple terms, what that means for simple concepts like dignity. Are we preserving the dignity of people that we are working with? Because I think that if I ask any kind of person if they want to be filmed when they are at their lowest, if they want to be recorded when they are sick or ill, or in a condition where they are fleeing, nobody says that they want to be filmed at their lowest. So why do we think it's okay to do that to other people just because they are displaced and because the power dynamics there allows that? And I think I kind of want to emphasize that a bit before we move on, that I am aware that in a lot of conditions, people accept that and they accept to be filmed or ask to be filmed. And there, I think you have to ask yourself, what is the power dynamic that is allowing that? Why are they accepting? Is there a power dynamic that you are creating as a journalist? Is there a power dynamic that the situation of violence is creating so that they have actually no real power there to say no to you because of whatever services that you can bring them or whatever expectancy of services or help that can be provided. So there's a power dynamic I think that people need to be aware of and always question, what is the underlying power dynamic that is generating consent in this situation if consent is provided.
How do you deal with these power dynamics in your work?
Yeah, this is such a tricky question because power is so complex, right? And I'm trying to find the right word. I want to say it slips into everything. It's overlapping, it's interrelational, it's layered, it's intersectional, meaning that we all have different types of power. We have different levels of power, but even me as someone who is a refugee, for example, in today's world, who is stateless, I have no citizenship of any country in this world. Me and you maybe have different amounts of power here, but still, I, due to maybe my work or my position, have a different power dynamic than people who are my family and friends back home. So power is very layered, and it's very hard to say that I have a concrete way of dealing with it. One thing I might say is that trying always to recognize the people that you are working with as equal in terms of perception and trying to always put their dignity first. For me, I always think of putting the concept of dignity as at the center of everything. So when I'm having a conversation with someone, I'm always thinking, is their dignity being conserved? If I was in their place, would I feel dignified in this exact conversation? Or do I feel like I'm taking something from them without giving something in return? Am I extracting, knowing that what they get out of this is way less than what I'm getting? Then I realize there's a power dynamic and I either need to step down, step back, or I need to ask them as equal partners what they want out of this. Let people decide what kind of stories they want to say and how do they want to say those stories and lead the way. That kind of shifts the power dynamic a little bit. Yeah, letting other people take the lead, I think, shifts the dynamic for me. Let them take the steering wheel on what story matters, what doesn't. And talking about this, there's a very old piece, maybe 20 years ago now, I don't know, but something I read when I was younger. And it was an article, I think, titled Palestinian Refugees Are Not at Your Service. And it talks about, again, journalists and researchers that come and treat you as a refugee as if you work for them. So you have to provide the data that they want from you, and they don't care about anything else because they're coming to interview you about this specific topic and nothing else matters. And they lead with that they're here to get what they want. And that article kind of explains that we don't work for you. We're not here at your service. We don't owe you anything. And we are equal human beings. So we want to share what we want to share, what we feel comfortable sharing, what we think is worth sharing, what we think the world should hear. And I think that an ethical journalist or a researcher or a humanitarian aid worker needs to be open to listen to that and find value in that. Find why is that so important to that community and put that out there, because if it's meaningful for the community, then that has to be a priority for the researcher or for the journalists as well. You need to be able to find value on that rather than come with your own agenda that isn't shared with the community, maybe.
You describe yourself also as a researcher who is interested in the decolonial potential of refugee spaces. What do you mean by it?
Yeah, this is an identity that I've taken in the past few years after getting into academic research. And I've been really influenced by the decolonial turn and by these ideas that have been arising from decolonized places and communities all over the world, indigenous communities, post-colonial communities. And there's been this rise in theory that we need to kind of revisit everything that we know and the way we do things and kind of dissect and separate and understand which out of this comes from a legacy of colonial control and expansion. So what out of the things that we do are just traditions that colonial conquerors have done and practiced, such as, for example, arriving to collect data from species or treating humans as if they are knowledge subjects and then taking the information back to an imperial power or so on to be studies. This is, for example, a colonial legacy. This is something that has been practiced in colonial times for so long. And we've kind of normalized that over time to make it something so normal in research and journalism and any type of work, really. And decolonial studies is a way to invite us to rethink all of the things we've normalized, take out the colonial impact out of them, and maybe replace them or reshape them with practices that are more being derived from the communities themselves, practices that dignify the communities that we're working with. Creating more equitable relationships, creating stories that stem from the communities themselves. So it's about removing the colonial legacy, and it's about removing the colonial form of relationships that we have. For example, the humanitarian system is often described to be a replica of the colonial one, or the development system, for example, where you have development agencies or humanitarian agencies that intervene in areas that are struggling. They often do not really interpret or elaborate on the role of where these agencies come from or the connections of these agencies in the creation of the suffering in itself. So there's often not enough emphasis on the fact that these same agencies are funded by the same powers that create that suffering. Yeah, these agencies interfere in that suffering and try to fix it or alleviate it in ways that they think is reasonable. And that really brings back colonial imaginaries, right? The idea of the empire that is intervening in a place that they view is under-civilized and is struggling, and views that they can make it better with their knowledge and their way of doing things. So they take control of it, run it in ways that they deem are optimal. You have a similar dynamic with development agencies today, with humanitarian agencies. They intervene in places in ways that they deem suitable, they deem optimal, without often taking into consideration what the community really needs. And they always end up in producing this idea of the refugee or the vulnerable or the victim that has no identity, no name, no agency, no hope, no future. I think Lisa Maliki names it really well. She calls them speechless masses, just masses, big numbers. They're not really equal humans. So this is the colonial legacy that we have. And the decolonial thought would be to try to repair all of that in some way, change it, repair it. And obviously, we're not there yet in a moment where we can say, we have clear decolonial strategies and solutions, and they're not quick fixes. But I think we're at the moment where we're dismantling those colonial ways of doing things and just trying to build decolonial ones, I guess.
Do you feel that the narrative surrounding refugee communities has changed since you started your career?
That's actually a really interesting question. It has definitely been moving. It has definitely been changing. I don't know if I can say that it's changing in a positive or a negative manner because it's been growing in both directions. So in one way, you have people now that are more aware. They're doing the work. They are being involved in discussions around how to change things. They are learning from refugees themselves or other groups, and they're learning and studying and trying to build alternative spaces to build a different framework to cover refugee crises, for example. But you also have a different direction where refugees are being increasingly represented as the villain in the story. They're being represented as the source of devastation, specifically economic and political and social devastation in a lot of European communities, for example. So You do deal a lot with media representations that are inaccurate, depicting refugees as the sources of chaos or crime, for example, in a lot of European countries where they are being depicted as the reason why countries are feeling not safe. So it is really going in both directions. I would say there is a part that is being motivated by learning and by very ethical efforts being made, but there's also other part that is being motivated by political reasons and political motives to maybe instill specific political agendas that are maybe trying to push immigrants out of countries. So you have both scenarios, unfortunately.
How have the different audiences react to your research?
That's a really interesting question. I think, and here I'm going to probably quote Tuck and Yang, who say something about decolonial theory and methodology that we just talked about. And they say that decolonial work is always unsettling. And it's meant to be unsettling. It's not meant to be comfortable because no one creates change by keeping everyone comfortable. That's not how change happens. It is only normal that any critique or any attempt to dismantle systems that don't work is going to make some people feel critiqued, is going to make some people feel like change is hard and they're not willing to give up classical ways that they're used to. So the short answer to that would be that there's been very welcoming responses to my theories, but also to decolonial theories on representation of refugees in general. But there's also been a lot of unwelcoming responses who are from people who either don't want to change their ways, they feel that they've built a wealth of achievements in their career on very classical ways, and they don't want to see that being criticized. There's also, I guess, a lot of professionals who feel that their ways of doing things are now being undermined. And here I want to say that this isn't about undermining anyone. This is about improving the way we do things. This is about doing things in more ethical ways, in more equitable ways that will provide a representation that is meaningful for everyone. It's going to be more authentic, more real, but also more dignified, and that will have a positive impact on everyone. So it has been positive and negative, but I think that the negative is part of every critical theory or of every research and also journalistic work.
One last question. How do you think we can improve our way of working?
I think that's a really good question. To improve our ways of working, I think I will go back to the two ideas of letting the people we work with and who are at the center of our research, whether that's journalistic research or humanitarian research or academic research, letting the people who are at the center of this research take the wheel. Let them decide how your work is being done. What are the goals of your work? Let them decide what matters. Let them decide how to do the work, what kind of stories they want to tell, but how they want to tell these stories. Removing yourself as the researcher or as the person of power, removing yourself from that power. Because a researcher conducting research, in that moment, you have the power. A journalist who is interviewing people who have just been in a vulnerable situation, you are a power. A humanitarian aid worker who is collecting data from people or statistics, you have that power. Removing yourself from that situation of power and giving the people you're working with some amount of power over how this research goes, I think goes a long way. Not only does it rebuild the trust that refugees have lost with researchers over a long period of time, it repairs that trust little by little, but it also allows us to build narratives that are more real, more genuine, but also more dignified, more accountable. So I would say generally giving the power back, taking a back seat and letting the people at the center of the story really be the center of the story in a way.
Thank you so much, Yafa, for this. And thanks so much for joining me today in this conversation.
Thank you for having me. This was wonderful to have, and I look forward to having more discussions about it.